I want to first start off by thanking Amy for setting the tone and also thanking her for her scholarship. In fact, two scholars, I'm honored to be here with two scholars who largely influenced my dissertation, Amy Singer being one of them, other being Kambe's Nebasiri. His History of Islam in America is a must read for anybody wanting to understand the history of Islam in America. So, having gotten that out of the way, I think I want to jump right into the topic of my paper, which I've actually, the title is borrowed from Abdullahi Naim's paper, A Kinder, Gentler Islam, in which essentially, I think he wrote this in the mid-90s or early 2000s, essentially arguing against Sharia. He's a legal scholar, so his whole trope is, for those who are familiar with Naim's work, is essentially saying, we need secular governments around the world, and essentially building on a very secular basis for government as such. So I borrowed that title to argue for a more nuanced understanding of philanthropy in this whole debate of secular versus traditional. And I'm coming from a position where I think we need a more nuanced understanding of philanthropy as a discursive tradition. I don't think Islamic philanthropy or American Muslim philanthropy or Islamic philanthropy anywhere in the world can be just juxtaposed with epistemologies that we have borrowed from the West, or even, I think what is at the core of this discussion is really what is Islamic. So with that as a starting point, I want to make 4 key points and take this discussion forward. The first real argument I think we're dealing with here is what is the role of philanthropy in community building in both America, which is my geographic focus, as well as internationally. And as Amy Singer has pointed out, and as other scholars have written on this extensively, philanthropy plays a very, very core function. In fact, one project which I'm working on right now with Sharik and a related project which I'm working on individually is to look at the evolution of Islamic schools in the US. And for those who are familiar with this space, realize the core function or the core idea behind forming both Islamic centers and Islamic schools in the US. And the idea is not only about preserving culture or education, but I think about building community. It's about preserving culture, building community, and offering centers of learning where Islam is preserved and propagated to the next generation. So to that extent, I think philanthropy is a very core function of community building, and this aspect needs to be investigated a little further. The next point really is in understanding the over-securitization of philanthropy itself. We heard in the introductory session the need for looking at how the whole securitization debate has impacted Islamic philanthropy, and the need to reassess that and to really see how internally Muslims give and what are the practices that have informed giving within these communities. Sometimes these might fall outside of the whole bureaucratic process, meaning one example which I can share from the nonprofit sector, which I'm closely aligned with, is the whole idea of documenting your giving. And as Amy pointed out earlier, many of the interviews that I've conducted in the past and the ones that I'm doing right now, a lot of donors really don't want the tax benefits, for instance, or even the motivations for giving are not entirely for tax deductions. So how do you, it's more to please God or to please, or for a better hereafter, for instance. So how do you deal with these epistemologies in this context of over-bureaucratized setup of philanthropic giving, where everything is either the assumption, even if it's not in practice, the assumption being that most giving is for tax deduction or as a tax incentive. And thirdly, I also suggest, I think that we need to look at how Islamic practices are working more in terms of relational aspect with other epistemologies in the West. And when we speak of Islamic philanthropy in the West particularly, I think we really need to pay attention also to what we mean by Islam. Because there are multiple versions of what it means to be Islamic, multiple versions of Islamic philanthropy in the West itself. So without really deconstructing that, without really going deep into each of these aspects, it's impossible to really form a clear picture. Let me give you an example of that. When I was interviewing Islamic principals and board members of Islamic schools. Of course, your sample set has to be, me and Sharik, we initially came up with this data set of about 280 schools, which is the entire universe, in our view, of full-time daycare Islamic schools. And we made that data set, and of those, we selected about 30 of them for interviews. So we first sent out the survey and whatnot. And then we realized, okay, survey data is good, but we need more. We need more depth. We need to really go into this. So we started doing interviews. And I've done about 18 interviews so far. And one of the things that really struck me was when I interviewed the mainline Sunni schools. They have a very specific understanding of what philanthropy is. When I use the language of zakat with Shia schools, now that's where the interesting thing comes up. They don't have a concept of traditional Sunni zakah, right? And also the way that zakah is understood, or philanthropy, to use the common term, within the Shia context is very different. And you're talking about the same country, the same economic system, the same epistemology that we're trying to transpose. Now, this nuance really struck me, as a practicing Muslim, as somebody who's seen these practices, who has Sunni, Shia, non-believing, all kinds of friends. Even to me, it was somewhat new. So how do you juxtapose this in an understanding of philanthropy, the term? I think is very important as we move forward. So going back to Anaim's contention that we need a kinder, gentler Islam, I think this paragraph would help understand what I'm talking about. I just read this out. Anaim says, his argument is that attempts at establishing historical Sharia in contemporary time misses the point about social justice and equality in the modern era. His argument is based on the premise that Sharia and its interpretation should be contextualized to current day realities and must be cognizant of the changes that are taking place demographically, culturally, and socially, both in the Muslim majority countries and where Muslims are a minority, to adapt our lives, all the while living ethical lives and that are inspired by Islamic values. He argues that there is no need for imposing Sharia on non-Muslims, for instance, in a Muslim country. This narrative does not sit too well in many circles where this call is seen as an attack on religion or imposing secular ideals on Muslims, to whom Islamic plays a central role in organizing their lives. But as his work shows and empirical examples from Muslim NGO space demonstrate, perhaps Muslims are no less Muslims by living in a Christian majority country. There are also no less Muslim by not going to the mosque regularly or practicing in humanitarian activities that benefit non-Muslims or atheists. So one of the interesting things, takeaways from this is also the whole notion of what can zakat or Muslim philanthropy be used for. Can it be used only to benefit Muslims? That's an ongoing debate within the Muslim praxis. Also theologically, there's a huge debate, especially in the West. A lot of ulama have come up, including I think the council in Chicago, I forget the name, but they have argued that yes, you can, in humanitarian contexts or other contexts, your zakat can go to non-Muslims. So there is no really binding, precept on that. So the essential point here that Anaim's thesis really suggests, or he's trying to really juxtapose secularism and tradition, and trying to argue that we need to move away from this whole traditional understanding to a secular sort of notion to project, or rather create a discourse of public Islam, which is kindler and gentler. I'm arguing that it's already present. I think what we really need to do is to unearth these examples, case studies, and to really dig deeper and see how these transformations within tradition are occurring. Because if one looks closely, as Amy's presentation again shows, and as one scholar of the Hizmet movement, actually, interestingly, Pim Valkenburg, who writes in his book, Revival of Islam Through Service, he argues again that among Turkish Muslims, and I read his quote, I have often noticed that Turkish Muslims who belong to this movement are bridge builders between cultures and religions. They represent an important development in the Muslim world that is often overlooked in the public media. So I think at the level of discourse, in the level of Islam in the public sphere, I think philanthropy can play a very important role, despite the fact of what's happening in Turkey. I think that's just an egregious example of over-politicization of philanthropy, if you will, building again on what Amy has just presented. I think what we really need to do is At some level, depoliticize it, in my understanding. Look also at the social community building aspects of philanthropy, especially in the context where Muslims are a minority, because in my own understanding, I grew up in India, I've lived in the Middle East for a while, I've been in the US for about 8 years now. Islam in each context, or Islamic practices in each context, operate very differently. I mean, there is no one Islamic thing, as Sharik pointed out earlier, and as many scholars have suggested. Even the same practices, the same understandings of philanthropy, for instance, need to be really contextualized. They're not timeless, so obviously, it's not, and you can't go with an Orientalistic understanding of this timeless thing that has existed forever. I mean, there's no such thing. I think Islam of the Prophet's time is very, very different from the Islam of today, and that applies even to philanthropic practices. So I think I end with this note, essentially arguing for looking at the community building role of philanthropy to really contextualize not only the discourse of philanthropy in the public sphere as something which must be seen in a very specific local context and be interpreted in the realities of the day. And I think only by doing that and by paying close attention to how Muslim practices are interpreting the theology can one really gain a useful understanding of what it means to be Islamic, what is an Islamic practice, and I think ultimately, as Sharik rightly pointed out, what is really philanthropy in this context and in this situation. Thank you.